So with the brand new Michael Myers film Halloween Ends coming out tomorrow as of filming this, yeah, I figured it was time to start covering some more Halloween films here on the channel. So we're going to be talking about the original 1978 film that I've seen many times. And I'm kind of ashamed to say I was kind of falling behind in the last couple years and had not seen the 2018 Halloween, nor had I seen the follow-up Halloween Kills. As a longtime horror slasher fan and fan of the series, I am ashamed to say that, but I gotta be honest about it. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into my quick review roundup on these three movies leading up to the brand new one, Halloween Ends. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and today, like I said at the very intro of this video, we're going to be doing a full review roundup of 3 Halloween films in this franchise. The original film, the newer 2018 Halloween, which is technically the 3rd film in the franchise to be called Halloween, but is not connected to the remake that Rob Zombie did, and is the sequel to the first Halloween that already had a sequel called Halloween 2, but that doesn't count anymore, so you jump straight to this 2018 Halloween. And then we got Halloween Kills as well. So yeah, definitely got a lot to say on these movies, and without further ado, let's get into the very first one, Halloween. Written, directed, and musically composed by John Carpenter, the director who's got just a huge filmography of fantastic films, who wrote this film alongside Deborah Hill, and stars people like Donald Pleasance as Dr. Loomis, Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie, as well as others like Kyle Richards, Brian Andrew, Nancy Stevens, and many others, and is the origin story of Michael Myers, the slasher. One of my favorite things about doing videos like this here on the channel is the fact that there are so many films that are classics that I've yet to cover here on the channel, with nearly 800 videos here on the channel covering everything from Disney Channel original movies to horror slasher classics to things like Dracula from 1931 to modern day films. I mean, I've covered a wide array of things here on the channel, and the unfortunate side of things is that there's only so little time to deal with this kind of stuff and make content and talk about this kind of stuff. But it also excites me because there are still so many franchises that I grew up with that are big, long-lasting franchises that I have not even touched here on the channel yet. So many movies that I have so many opinions on that I've been dying to cover here. And yeah, Halloween is one I've wanted to dive deeper into. The only 2 that I've covered here on the channel so far are the 2 Rob Zombie films, funny enough. The first one that Rob Zombie did, and then the sequel, Halloween 2, which are not connected to this continuity that we're talking about here today. And for anybody who's not really familiar with these movies altogether, maybe you're still kind of a newcomer to Halloween, there was Halloween, Halloween 2, then they made Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. That was kind of like a separate thing. It was supposed to be an anthology series from then on. People didn't really like that, so they brought Michael Myers back for the 4th installment, and there were a few others after that. Jamie Lee Curtis returned in that timeline as well. And then yeah, Rob Zombie ended up doing the remakes where we get, you know, essentially retold versions that are a little bit more gory and brutal and not necessarily better, but you know, they're there. There are reviews here on the channel if you're interested in hearing my thoughts on those movies. And then yeah, now they decided to do this whole reboot kind of thing where it's like a re-sequel kind of thing where we have this follow-up years later, and they have this much darker Laurie Strode who's prepared to take on, you know, the classic Halloween franchise character Michael Myers. And yeah, it's just interesting to see the direction that this franchise has gone. There's been so many ups, downs, you know, now we have a new canon, the remakes, it just gets really messy. But yeah, talking about now the 1978 film, I have so many fond memories of watching this film back in the day on the various Halloween marathons that would play year after year on TV. And yeah, you know, I've talked about it here on the channel on dozens of occasions. I'm a huge fan of horror slashers, Chucky, Jason, Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, and the list goes on. I just love it. It's just stuff that I grew up really enjoying when I would watch these marathons with my mom or my sister or my grandma as a kid. Of course, I was watching the, you know, content safe versions that were, censored for TV back in the day when I was a kid. But as I started to get older and started to dip my toes into more horror and start to watch some DVDs and some VHS tapes, obviously before DVDs, I started to, dabble in some creepier stuff and some uncensored stuff. And I've always loved the genre when it comes to slashers, because for me, they were the ones that allowed me to kind of have my toes in that Halloween creepy spirit without ever feeling too horrified, because eventually most of these franchises would ultimately become pretty over the top and schlocky and campy. And so that's something I actually enjoy about the franchise. But what I like about this first film is, though it is dated in a lot of ways, it's just a straightforward classic horror film. And it's crazy because you watch some of the sequels or even some of the new ones that we're going to be talking about here in this video, and there is this element of just noticing that even though there are so many dated elements about this original 1978 film, it's still, I feel, almost a more entertaining film than a lot of the films that might do a lot of things better than this movie. At its core, this is a pretty straightforward film. There's Michael Myers, who killed his family, or killed his sister, I should say, when he was really young, dressed as a clown on Halloween. He ends up escaping from an insane asylum, and then decides to start killing everybody and terrorizes Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, in, I believe, her first role in a movie. I could be wrong, but I believe that's the case. And either way, it's Jamie Lee Curtis was not who she is today, and she's definitely not who she is as an actress in these newer films. Even though I have some criticisms on those new films, she's phenomenal in them, and she's obviously grown as an actress so much over the decades. And so in this film, she's not necessarily incredible. And I think that's one of those things about this movie that is interesting, because it's definitely a movie of its time. There are moments in this movie that are laughably cheesy, like Michael Myers standing in broad daylight just staring at people behind bushes or behind, laundry that's hanging on a clothesline. It just ultimately is kind of goofy in so many ways. And there are so many elements about this movie that, watching it with modern eyes, you can't help but laugh at how funny Michael Myers looks at times in this movie. But with that said, it's still a really entertaining film that I find to be well paced. Donald Pleasance is really, I think, what sells the darkness of Michael Myers and his threat over the course of the film. The way he talks about Michael Myers, he really commits to the performance as Dr. Loomis, and I think that's definitely one of the best parts of what makes this movie work. If you didn't have Dr. Loomis, I feel like the overall threat of Michael Myers isn't nearly as severe. The way that he hypes him up in a way throughout the course of the film in between the kills is ultimately what kind of makes him a more menacing character, and that's why Dr. Loomis's kind of energy would end up lasting over the franchise, even in films that don't even feature him, simply because of the fact that I feel like the way that he spoke about Michael is without a doubt what really enhances the movie and makes Michael feel more menacing. When it comes to Laurie Strode, the iconic character, she's ultimately the original Scream Queen, and I have a lot of respect for Jamie Lee Curtis, of course, as an actress, and I have seen this movie a million times, so it has a very special nostalgic place in my heart. But I wouldn't necessarily say that her or majority of the performances here are necessarily great. There's a lot about this movie in terms of performances that is really dated and cheesy in a lot of ways, and it's not necessarily phenomenal. That's not to say I don't like it, but it's definitely not top tier is what I'll say. It's without a doubt there are elements about the whole performance and dialogue and sometimes the reactions of these actors and actresses that ultimately does make you very aware of its time and its dated elements, without a doubt. With that said, though, there are still some really great uses of practical effects here. That's one of my favorite things about early slashers, whether it be late 70s like this or the early 80s or just throughout the 80s in general. A lot of practical effects that made these movies really stand out. So there are some really good uses of practical effects and camera work here to make Michael Myers really menacing, and all of that still really works. One thing that's interesting to me, and something that I think we all love, right, is that Michael Myers theme song that John Carpenter came up with. That piano music is iconic. It's just something that resonates in everybody's mind. And watching this movie, I almost forgot how sped up this iteration is in this movie. It almost feels at times like the tempo is a little bit all over the place. It's iconic, but rewatching it, it kept me kind of distracted at times. I kind of kept thinking to myself, I do enjoy how they kind of slow it down and kind of give it a little bit more drama as the films would progress. It's specifically the ones that John Carpenter would end up still scoring. You can tell that he wanted to kind of slow down the tempo a little bit more as time went on, because I feel like the tempo was a little bit too fast when it comes to his iconic song in that very first movie. But yeah, without a doubt, despite the dated elements in terms of performances and some things that are a little bit laughable and cheesy, like, like I said, Michael Myers standing behind clothing hanging over a clothesline. Yeah, overall, I still find this to be a classic Halloween horror film to watch. I still think it's one of the best in the franchise. I think it depends, right? Some people enjoy the ones that have more kills and have more gore. There are films in this franchise that have better kills and have more gore and more practical effects use, but maybe have a weaker story or an even worse acting. There are films that look better than this one in terms of visual effects and camera work, cinematography, things that kind of just came with the decades as the movie making would change. But there's so much about this film that still really works in a lot of ways that some of those films don't work. And yeah, for even some of the worst in this franchise and some of the best, I think that this one still stands out there as one of the best. And I think a lot of people would actually say the best. I don't know if it's necessarily my favorite to watch in the franchise. I think there are some later on that are a little bit more campy that I think are a little bit more entertaining to watch. But this is definitely the standout one when you think of the franchise. You're just instantly going to go back to the OG film, which is why I believe they chose to do what they did next with our next film we're going to talk about, and that is 2018's Halloween. This time around, you have David Gordon Green directing this film, and he wrote it alongside people like Jeff Fradley and Danny McBride, which I thought was interesting when I first heard, and of course brings back Jamie Lee Curtis as Laurie Strode after many years. And this time around, she's strapped and ready to take on Michael Myers, and she's doing it alongside people like Judy Greer, Andy Matichak, as well as Will Patton. And then of course you have John Carpenter returning to produce as well as do the musical score. So as I just mentioned, Laurie Strode is strapped up and ready to go. She has spent the last few decades preparing for Michael Myers' return, and as he's going to be transferred from one mental institution to another, we already know what happens. He breaks out, and now Laurie Strode is ready, and she's trying to get her family all prepared. Her family's kind of distant from her now because of the way that she chose to raise her daughter, played by Judy Greer in the film. And yeah, she had this huge plan set up. She has tons of weapons. She has a bunker. She has traps set, and she's ready to take out Michael Myers. And yeah, so like I said, I hadn't seen this movie. I didn't watch it in theaters, and I heard some of the buzz around this one, and specifically the last one that a lot of people don't like, Halloween Kills, and I was very curious to see what I was going to think about going into these movies, kind of having moved away from the discussion of the movies. Some time has passed, and I figured, hey, I'm going to watch them and just kind of not really even be seeped in any sort of online conversation about it, and just watch them on my own. And yeah, I could say overall I enjoyed this one, 2018's Halloween. I didn't love it, but I did enjoy it. There's a lot about this film that I think, definitely has some better elements in comparison to previous films in this franchise. There are plenty of installments in this franchise that are stinkers in terms of performance, in terms of, camera work, in terms of special effects at times, and characters. And I think that this is definitely one of the more balanced films in the series in terms of telling a straightforward narrative. With that said, there's definitely some issues in terms of some of the dialogue choices at times and character choices. And, like a lot of these slasher films, there are going to be throwaway characters that are appearing here and there that you ultimately spend very little time with and are just there to be, essentially fodder for Michael Myers. So, when you're watching this movie, there are those dated elements that were more forgivable in films of the 80s that are still present here, which I guess you can say is consistent with the series, but at times does kind of make the film feel just like another run-of-the-mill slasher film. Though I will say that it is great to see Michael Myers in such great cinematography and lighting, and the overall look and feel of this film I think is pretty solid. There's nothing necessarily outstanding about the cinematography in terms of the actual camera work, but of course, just as these films progress over decades, we get better camera quality and stuff like that. So it is nice to see a really crisp Michael Myers film, and including Halloween Kills. I would argue that Halloween Kills is maybe the better looking film and arguably one of the best looking films in the franchise in terms of lighting and locations and things that they use. But yeah, so pretty much this whole movie is about Laurie Strode, being prepped, and she's obviously horrified, and she's got a lot of trauma that she's been dealing with over the decades as he's now released. And I'm not gonna lie when I say that I was kind of disappointed with just the way that they chose to play out all of this movie, because the premise is so interesting to me, and seeing the trailers leading up to it was so awesome. But I think one of the biggest issues that a lot of slashers have done in the past, especially modern installments, one of the things I always hoped that they would move away from is filling these movies with too many characters that ultimately becomes a point where you already know that all these characters are going to die, and you don't ever really attach yourself to anybody outside of the 2 or 3 characters that are core to the story. And in the case of this, there's maybe like 3 or 4 characters that are core to Laurie Strode's story that play out between this movie and Halloween Kills, and a whole lot of other characters that you just know are going to die. And so you have a very similar setup here, and I have a very similar criticism for both this movie and Halloween Kills, where it feels like modern day films with the modern day tools of making films for an iconic franchise that ultimately feel like, you know, Michael Myers number 5, you know what I mean? Like obviously like Halloween 5 or something like that in terms of performance and the oversaturation of characters. There's an element of this film and Halloween Kills that reminds me of something like, I don't know, Friday the 13th 7, you know what I mean? A bunch of random characters you don't care about that are just involved here, and you have a killer on the loose that's killing everybody. That's pretty much what's going on. And I think what was most disappointing about this film for me, despite liking how it looks, thinking the performances is definitely some of the best in the series. I loved hearing the score again. I thought the tone, the look, the feel of the film was great. I think overall, in terms of the actual technical elements of this film, it's awesome. Some of the best that the franchise has ever had. But on a story level, I think ultimately what's disappointing is you have this awesome premise of Laurie Strode being set up to fight Michael Myers. But by the time we get to the end, everything about her plan went to shit. You know, all the years of preparing her daughter, outside of a couple of moments, all those years that ultimately ruined their family, didn't really amount to much. You know, Judy Greer's character is having all these moments of fighting against her mother and not necessarily wanting to live this life. And she has a couple of cool moments in this movie where she like tries to fight Michael Myers and she acts tough and takes some of that training and uses it, but a lot of it isn't really utilized. And when at the end of the day, everything kind of goes to shit, and all those years and decades of Laurie Strode preparing really amounted to nothing. And yeah, like I said, I have a lot of those positives on the technical elements of the film, but the writing ultimately left me a little bit disappointed. I liked the kills in the movie, as I typically do. There were some brutal ones, but yeah, you know, in terms of the conversation about Laurie Strode's whole plan going to crap, we gotta jump into the latest installment, and that is Halloween Kills. Once again directed by David Gordon Green, who wrote this film again alongside Danny McBride and a different writer this time around, Scott Teems. This film once again stars people like Jamie Lee Curtis, Judy Greer, Andy Matichak, Will Patton, has John Carpenter returning to do the musical score and produce once again. And then we have some new faces returning to the franchise as well, like Kyle Richards and Nancy Stevens, and people like Anthony Michael Hall and Robert Longstreet also playing characters who have history with Michael Myers, some of them being obviously from previous films. And this film picks up literally right as the other one was ending. You have Laurie Strode, her daughter played by Judy Greer, and her granddaughter, which another thing I forgot to mention too, why is her granddaughter consistently calling her grandmother? I don't know, sometimes it just sounds so forced. Where is grandmother? I don't know why they did that. It just seemed cheesy on a writing level. Like, did you speak to grandmother yet? I meant to mention that for the other section of this review, but that was just a weird thing to me throughout this movie. But anyway, they're leaving the house that they have now thought that they have left Michael Myers burning at and dead. They thought that they had him dead, and they thought that they had him trapped, you know? And of course it sucks for us as an audience knowing the next one's coming, because, you know, obviously he's still alive. But yeah, so I like the fact that these movies are picking up right after one another. I'm excited to see how Halloween Ends picks up and ends, and I'm kind of glad that I watched these within the last couple of days, because I feel like I was able to enjoy these maybe a little bit more than most that had to wait, you know, a couple of years to watch Halloween Kills, where it feels like if you watch them back to back, it feels like one big movie. So I felt like I was able to benefit from that a little bit in terms of the story flowing a little bit better for me. But yeah, overall, this was a movie that was completely messy in terms of its narrative and its characters, and it has way too many characters. As I mentioned before, I think one of the biggest issues that I had with this newest iterations of Halloween is that it just kind of leaned into a lot of the negatives of previous Halloween films with oversaturation of characters. Now, I will say this movie is a bloodbath, so there are so many kills, and as a longtime slasher fan and a fan of those older slasher films that I also am saying are not that great at times, ultimately, there were so many moments in this movie that had me really engaged and excited to see, because I love seeing the slasher stuff. There were so many great practical effects used here, and I really love that stuff. As a longtime horror horror fan and somebody who just loves seeing blood, guts, and gore when it comes to movies and horror, yeah, that's something I always can appreciate, the hard work that goes into practical effect work, and I think that without a doubt is completely shining here. On top of that, like I mentioned in my last section of the review, I think this movie is arguably one of the best shot and looking films in the franchise. Now, I don't think that the cinematography is necessarily anything overly stylish, but I think that the lighting itself, the way that they frame a lot of these shots, ultimately I thought was really cool and stylized in comparison to some of the other previous films in the franchise, especially near the beginning where you got, Michael Myers coming out of that house that's on fire. Really loved the look of all that. So visually, I found this film to be appealing. And I think one of the greatest things that this film and the last one, Halloween 2018, have really gotten down is Michael Myers. I think that he has been wildly menacing, and I've really enjoyed the look and feel of him over the course of the film. So his kills and everything that has to do with the effect work here and the overall technical elements of the film, I think are great. But I think my biggest issue with this film is every issue I had with the last film, which was that it just feels like everything that our characters have worked for really has amounted to nothing. This is essentially two movies that should have been one that could have cut out a lot of crap and a lot of nonsensical characters to just give us a more streamlined narrative where at least part of Laurie Strode's plan worked, part of her preparation worked. But this movie ends with Judy Greer's character getting killed, her daughter, and her whole life, the whole reason that she split from her family and kind of had a disconnect and hasn't really been able to have the chance to, be around her granddaughter and all those great things is the sad reality that she is, kind of not crazy, but she's, completely paranoid and has lost everything about who she is because of Michael Myers. And, she spent all this time training and raising her daughter. And then they kill her at the end of this last movie when she hasn't really had too many moments outside of a couple of moments, including a couple in this movie, where she actually shows that her mother's training really paid off. I think that was some of the coolest stuff, was knowing that, listen, okay, fine, we've had our differences, but everything I trained you for is happening now. Everything is happening now, so we need to make moves. And so when you see Judy Greer having those moments, you think, all right, fuck yeah, let's get it going. Now, of course, we know there's another film coming, so you know that Michael Myers isn't going to die, but just the way that I think they've kind of written up this hype of these characters being prepared to ultimately throw it straight to the ground ultimately has created a very anticlimactic narrative overall. I think that the movie could have been a lot stronger in terms of its overall narrative, and it could have cut down tremendously on the amount of characters that they chose to have crammed in here. Even the returning characters that have returning actors, they're ultimately just treated as more fodder for Michael Myers, which is a disappointment. I think that this movie, again, visually looks great. I just think that the story for me ultimately in these last two films has just undercut everything that the main characters have done, and I don't really understand why. So with the new film coming out, Halloween Kills, So with the new film now coming out, Halloween Ends, I'm definitely curious to see what people have to say about it, and I'm curious what I think about it and how they wrap this up. Quite frankly, as a huge Michael Myers fan, as a fan of this franchise, I just hope that they are able to tell some sort of an interesting story for the modern age. There are films from back in the day that are more forgivable in terms of their cheesiness because they're of a different time and they're part of a different world at this time, at this point, really, we all had to have a nostalgia for them. They're the perfect kind of films that you'd see at the Halloween season on some TV marathon, and again, it just kind of has a charm of a time. But movies are different now, and I think that we as an audience have different expectations and hope for stories that are gonna, excite us again. And ultimately, when we see a lot of the same in movies just with a little bit of a sleeker look over it, it can just feel redundant and ultimately feel a little bit underwhelming because it's like we've been there, done that kind of thing for literally decades. So I'm going to wrap this up right here, and I just want to say a big thanks to you guys for sticking around and hearing me ramble about these 3 Halloween films, and I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say. Which of these 3 films do you enjoy most, and are you excited for the newest installment, Halloween Ends? Also, what are your guys' thoughts on even having this new canon? Do you feel like it was complete kind of disgrace to the original timeline to just make a new canon? Definitely want to hear your thoughts on all of that. Please leave any and all thoughts down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.